thank you to everyone for joining us today to discuss urban development policy in general, and in particular, the successes that New Rochelle, New York had in overcoming obstacles and developing their downtown. I've been writing and researching about urban development for almost a decade, and it can be a depressing area of public policy. So when we learned of the good example, the positive example of New Rochelle, we were really eager to publish more about it and to have this talk. So thank you again for your time. And as Sarah said, let me encourage you, if you have questions throughout the talk, to type them into the Q&A area, and we will endeavor to address as many of them as possible in the last few minutes. Let me introduce my three panelists, and we'll put a link to each of their bios in the chat. Salim Furth is a senior research fellow at the director of the Urbanity Project at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University in Virginia, where his research focuses on housing production and land use regulation. Philip Wharton is currently the CIO and managing partner of Twining Properties. Philip has spent his career in development across the country and largely focused around New York City as well. And Noam Bramson, elected mayor of New Rochelle in 2006 and is now serving his fourth term. Prior to that, Noam served 10 years on the New Rochelle City Council, so he's very well versed to talk about the city, where it was, and what brought them to make this innovation. Salim and Philip co-authored the case study we're talking about, called Zoning and Permitting Innovations Unlock Opportunity. You can find that report on our website, better-cities.org, and we'll link to that as well in the chat. So Salim, let me start with you. Before we get to the specifics of New Rochelle, characterize for us the state of urban development in US cities from a policy perspective. What's going on?
Thank you, Patrick. Great to be here with all of you, and I really appreciate your time and attention. So development has a lot of different dimensions, and different cities are looking for different things. Some cities are looking to not change at all and doing their darndest to just stay the same. But others are always trying to bring in more jobs and to create economic development via targeted incentives, right? So you can get horror stories like Lordstown, Ohio, where General Motors got $60 million in state tax abatements to keep jobs there local for 30 years. They only lasted 10 years before the Chevy Cruze sort of failed there, and the state sued them to try to get half that money back. Then the state turned around and gave $20 million more to a new startup, Lordstown Motors, which is a year or two in, already starting to look like it's failing, despite getting $200 million loan from the feds. So there are all this money thrown at companies. We see this in small towns too. Winslow, Maine spent 2 decades shoveling money to one small company that was the tenant in a town-owned building. Finally, that company and the building were sold to a pair of business consultants, and we'll see just how committed the business consultants are to keeping jobs in Winslow. But the research shows that targeted economic subsidies don't usually work. Even when they work, in the sense of getting the business you were going after, they don't work in creating organic growth. There's all these places that think they're going to be the next Silicon Valley if they bring in, one computer company or something like that. But that's not how economic growth works. And these targeted subsidies don't seem to spill over or do much of anything for the rest of the economy. And I think New Rochelle, and there's other stories of cities doing this in different ways around the country. New Rochelle did something right by targeting a broad-based change. So instead of just wooing one specific champion or pushing one project, they said, we're going to have a broad-based change, and it's going to come from the demand that already exists in our economic context, and we're going to rely on that rather than trying to pick a winner to be the change that we want to see in our town.
So let me follow up on that, pick a winner. What motivates cities to offer targeted incentives? What are they trying to do? Why are they doing it? And do they think it works?
Yeah, they think it works, and there's a whole consulting industry that will tell them that it works. It's hard to convince people like, oh, you're a consultant who helps connect cities to businesses. you should now start telling them that none of this process works and that your job is irrelevant, right? That's not going to happen. So, that's why we have research. There's those of us who aren't, connected to any specific project. I was not involved in New Rochelle's at all. I came after the fact, just to write about it as a curiosity. And it's important that people have skin in the game and pitch their ideas. I have no problem with that. And sometimes local development officials can play matchmaker and help a business find a site in town that makes sense for them. I got no problem with that. But yeah, there's always this belief that it's the big thing that you see that's going to make the difference, and not the dozen little businesses that none of them on their own are big enough to really move the needle. But the truth is that's what a healthy economic landscape looks like, is lots and lots of small players, small investments, rather than the sort of the huge champion, or the big dice roll, in a case like General Motors.
Philip, let me ask you a similar question. What are the challenges, the obstacles that, from a developer's point of view, that you see around the country?
Yeah, I mean, the obstacles take a lot of different forms, but I think it's especially when it comes to housing, and in areas where there are already high housing prices and high rents that are not affordable to a lot of people. It's not so much about attracting the capital in. What they're trying to do is keep new projects out and keep density out and let density happen elsewhere. So it's a little bit different than the economic development. I think that they go together, but I think there's a vested interest that people have in their homes, and in their communities, and anything that threatens to change that can be very very painful, and people come out and protest very quickly to things that are different, and so the elected officials have to respond to that. I mean, I can give an example. In my town, I live in a nice suburban town. I have a quarter of an acre of land, and there was a house a few blocks away that was on 4 acres, and somebody bought the house and wanted to build 4 houses on 4 acres, and it was as if the world was coming to an end. It's going to change the quality of our lives, change the reason why we're in this town. I mean, it gets very heated and very personal, and so there's a lot at stake. A lot of people have a lot of their wealth tied up in the value of their homes, and so it's emotional, it's political, and when you fight each battle one by one, the people that are affected by that particular project are have a very strong voice.
Yeah.
And that's why I think the innovation in New Rochelle, which I was a part of and worked with the mayor on, took that project by project process away, which is what it's like in the rest of the country, and took a step back and said, let's set some ground rules ahead of time that we can agree on, and then let projects happen as long as they stay within those ground rules. And that takes a lot of the emotion. It's a much more rational process. You check the boxes. If you're in conformity, you have certainty of what you can build, and you have certainty of the time frame that you can build, that you can get your approvals on.
Philip, let me ask you, how do developers understand or talk about the targeted incentives that Salim spoke about? What is your understanding in their value, and how do they make a project more attractive to a developer, or maybe remove some of the obstacles?
Well, you would think that the more the incentives, the more successful they would be, but that's not always the case. We have New York City, who managed to decline Amazon from locating their second headquarters here. So it's effective in the short term, but I think you need to make long-term reforms in your community if you want to attract the long-term capital. So I think just a deal by deal, company by company, it's good it makes it easier for the companies, but it doesn't really create the environment for future growth on its own.
So Noam, fair play. If I have Philip defend all developers everywhere, let me ask you to speak for all policymakers everywhere. How do you react to what you've just heard, either development policy and its success or its necessity? You've been in public office for quite some time, and you've seen what your colleagues are dealing with around the country.
Yeah, look, we have to remember we live in a democracy. And so it is natural and appropriate for elected officials to reflect and act on the concerns that are articulated by the people that they represent. And to be clear, sometimes those concerns are legitimate. If growth is not planned well and carefully, it can indeed overburden services or overburden infrastructure or have a negative effect on the character of its surroundings. And so I think it's up to those of us who are in government to address those legitimate concerns with seriousness and intentionality and assure ourselves and assure our larger communities that the growth that we welcome is indeed well planned and will have benefits that are shared broadly and equitably. Once we have reached that conclusion, then I think we reach a point where chasing after unanimity is a fool's game, because you will never achieve it, and it can be paralyzing. And so at a certain point, political will needs to be demonstrated in order to pursue growth, and people in government should have the confidence that the positive change they achieve on the ground will ultimately address the doubts that people may have in the decision-making process. Phil is absolutely right that what we did in New Rochelle is not eliminate political and public involvement, but shift the structure through which that political and public involvement was applied to the challenge. So we made a very significant upfront investment in public dialogue and discussion about what the vision of our city ought to be, what values ought to be emphasized, what specific benefits we ought to aim to achieve. And then once that vision was established, that's where we pulled back from the political veto points, which ordinarily bedevil the development process, and established a much more clear and simple and predictable track for those who want to invest in our community, provided that investment is consistent with the vision that's been laid out through the community dialogue process.
So Noam, can you, and I'll ask Salim the same question, tell us about New Rochelle. I understand it's just outside of New York City, and my first thought, not being familiar with it, is that it has a lot going for it that other cities around the country might not have.
Well, since I'm in part the chief civic booster of New Rochelle, I'll certainly agree with that last statement. We have 80,000 residents. We are just north of the Bronx line, right outside of New York City. Exceptionally diverse by every metric, diverse in our demographic composition. We're about 40% non-Hispanic white, 30% Hispanic, 20% Black, 10% Asian mixed race and other. Diverse from a socioeconomic perspective, and diverse in our land use characteristics. We have an extensive waterfront, we have classic pre and post-war suburbia, and we have a more dense urbanized inner core. So a little bit of everything in New Rochelle. We also have terrific transit access, a Metro North station that's just half an hour from Grand Central, the only Amtrak stop that's between Manhattan and Connecticut. So lots of natural advantages, and yet for the last 2 generations, our downtown is chronically underperformed. It hasn't had the range of goods and services that our own residents expect. It has not provided housing opportunities that are sufficiently robust for all the layers of demand that exist. It just hasn't been an area that most people in New Rochelle have been proud to call the core of their community. And that sense of underperformance has been one of the reasons why there's been such a great desire on the part of city leadership to change the equation and help us achieve our potential.
So Salim, same question to you. How do you think of New Rochelle? How is it similar to cities around the country? How is it different?
Yeah, so New Rochelle is a really good microcosm of the whole New York City metro area. If you look at the stats that Mayor Bramson just rattled off, those look a lot like the broader New York City area, from Manhattan out to, Ulster County and out into New Jersey. It's the main way that it really differs from the rest of the country, and probably for most of our audience today, is the prices. Wages aren't especially high. There's some very affluent people on the north side of New Rochelle, but also lots of working class people. So the wages aren't exceptional. The prices are: median rent for a 2-bedroom apartment, something around $1,650 a month. And the median home price has risen over $100K during the pandemic, according to Zillow, and is about $780K for a typical detached house now. So that's very expensive. When I've visited New Rochelle, it's a secondary city, right? So it's on the outskirts of New York. So it's not its own main job hub. A lot of people are commuting into New York City or to other, places for employment, but it is a hub for, local commerce. It's where you're going to go out if you live in the area. You're not going to go into Manhattan for dinner most nights, but you might go down to downtown New Rochelle. So, I think of some other places. Silver Spring, Maryland, which is very close to where I live, is probably the most obviously comparable place, and I love Silver Spring. Fort Lauderdale, Florida, maybe Rock Hill, South Carolina, which is, kind of outside of Charlotte, has plenty of demand, plenty of growth because the Charlotte metro area is growing, but it has its own historic urban core, which has got a lot of vacant lots and is pretty tired compared to maybe how it was in its heyday. Murfreesboro, Tennessee might be another comp. So every place is unique, but I think this has some kind of mix of high prices, a second tier status as a suburb, but a suburb that has its own, is a true hub for, kind of lifestyle amenities. And that puts it in a good position. You're absolutely right. I think a lot of places, other than having to pay the costs of renting there, I think, a lot of people would be happy to have New Rochelle's kind of advantages and stats.
Noam, in the paper, I think it's pointed out that there was no new development after 2007. If I've got that correct, can you characterize? You said earlier that the people in the city basically felt that New Rochelle was underperforming. What does that mean exactly? And to the best of your ability, why was that?
So we'd had some one-off successes in the 1990s and early 2000s, a number of transit-oriented developments. All of that, however, ground to a halt when the Great Recession hit. Now, that in and of itself was not unusual. It was an experience that you would find in communities all around the country. What was perhaps more disturbing is that even as the national economy and regional economy began to recover, New Rochelle was still lagging. It was very difficult for us to restart the economic engine. And our conclusion was that from an investor and developer perspective, the risk-reward ratio in New Rochelle was simply not a positive one. Notwithstanding the stats about rent levels and housing prices that Salim ticked off a moment ago, our downtown economy was not regarded as being as mature and well fleshed out as those of some of our regional competitors. So the returns that a typical investor could count on were somewhat iffy. And at the same time, because of the cumbersome approval process in New York State generally, the upfront investment that was required in planning and the approval process, as well as the uncertainty about how that approval process would ultimately evolve, those were real deterrents to investment. And so even though we tried a variety of traditional models, marketing one site or another site, even working with property owners to aggregate land in order to create development areas, we really were not able to get traction until we put in place a new framework at the end of 2015, which I think will be the focus of our conversation today. So I can get into that now or later in the conversation.
Well, I just want to understand a little bit more what the city was struggling with. You said you kind of used all the tools that cities around the state used. I imagine you're familiar with the TIF and enterprise zones and abatements, and the entire state was working within, with those tools. Was New Rochelle just not seeing interest, or were you not willing to provide the incentives that developers wanted?
We were prepared to provide incentives for the right kind of development. But yes, just what you said, there was not sufficient interest. I think most investors looked at New Rochelle, at downtown New Rochelle specifically, and saw it as a marginal market with high barriers to entry. And so despite the city government saying the right things and being prepared to use certain tools to attract that investment, most simply looked in other directions and concluded that the risk-reward ratio was more favorable in places like Stamford or White Plains, or the 5 boroughs or Bergen County. These are all sort of comparable areas in the region where dollars can flow instead of New Rochelle.
Philip, what does a potential developer look for when you're examining a city as opportunity? How do you weigh risk and reward? What attracts you, and what amounts to red flags?
Well, the entitlement process is a big part of it, especially in this part of the country, and also in California. It's uncertain in timing and cost, and so you have to weigh that process. You look at what other development has been done there, how the city has handled development up to this point, and then what is the market opportunity. So I think it's not just the case that the New Rochelle is an area of high demand. I would say it was medium demand, where there's clearly a market. There's clearly going to be you're going to be able to rent or sell homes, but the struggle to get there is more than offsets that under the old rules. Whereas another town, say if you're looking to build in Greenwich, Connecticut, you will have a difficult time getting through a process, but you have a luxury good at the end. And when there are these costs that are associated with the approvals and the uncertainty, that raises the cost for the developer and limits what he can build, because you have to recoup all those costs somehow. And so the only things that get built in a lot of these communities are the very high end, and that's purely a result of, not purely, but it's largely a result of that extra cost that's put on the process, and it's a big obstacle. So what New Rochelle has been able to modify those rules and open things up in a way, and just so everyone on the call knows, it worked. And I was involved heavily with it for 2 years. It worked way better than any of us ever expected. So clearly there's something happening in New Rochelle that I think people should pay attention to. And I spend a good part of my time looking and talking to city officials around the country to see what can be learned here, what can be applied elsewhere, because the proof's out there. There's, I would say, about $3.5 billion of investment. If you look at about 7,000 new units of construction, new units of housing that have been approved there. So it's there's plenty of capital out there, and that sort of goes back to your question: how does the process impact what gets built? Hugely, because we just went from 10 years of nothing to 5 years of huge investment. So it has a major impact on what gets built.
So Noam, let's talk about that. First, what spurred this? What aha moment, or who approached whom, and how did this get started? The innovation, the decision to do things differently here.
Well, underlying all of it is a couple of generations of frustration, which I've already described, a sense that our downtown ought to be better and more vibrant than in fact it was. And sort of having tried traditional approaches and found them wanting, the city government was eager to embrace a new method that might work. So it began with an internal exercise, looking at the publicly owned properties in our downtown area, undertaking planning analyses to kind of think through in general terms what sort of build out would be appropriate on those areas, and then essentially marketing those resources with the goal of attracting a master developer who could partner with us. We ultimately selected RXR, which is a well-regarded real estate firm working primarily in the New York metro area. So that's one piece of the puzzle. RXR, through an agreement with them, has an enhanced opportunity to develop on the publicly owned sites. And we think that's beneficial to us because they have the capacity to undertake catalytic investments that are positive for the community, and also because their involvement in New Rochelle sends a signal to the rest of the marketplace that this is an area in which one can do business successfully. To the extent that there's a herd mentality, RXR was in a position to lead the herd. And yet, I don't think that's the most important piece of the puzzle. because we simultaneously put in place two other features. One is a form-based zoning code that governs the entire downtown area, not just those public sites on which RXR has an enhanced development opportunity, which is about 12 acres, but rather 300 acres. Form-based code is very flexible with respect to use and therefore market responsive. At the same time, it is highly prescriptive when it comes to design and incorporates all the best planning practices that we know create walkable, pleasant urban environments. And we undertook an environmental review for our entire build-out scheme. So rather than requiring an individualized, very costly environmental impact statement for each project, we went through that process for the 7,000 housing units and 12 million square feet of build-out that we were contemplating, with all the public hearings and public approvals that are required. Once that was adopted, it had the effect of sweeping away what would otherwise be hundreds of thousands of dollars of upfront cost and uncertainty that would be visited upon each project. RXR paid for the form-based zoning code and for the environmental review. That is essentially what they delivered to us in exchange for the development rights on the public properties. And in doing so, they in effect subsidized the work of every other developer who did not have to bear any upfront cost at all, but instead found New Rochelle to be a more hospitable investment environment. And as Phil said a moment ago, the effect has been dramatic. We've approved 30 projects. 6 of them are already completed and leasing up. 11 of them are under construction right now. Several more will begin construction within the next few months. So it is a change of a scale and magnitude that we have not experienced before in our history. And there's no question in my mind that it would not have happened without this framework.
Salim, what's your reaction to this? It seems like any one of these 4 ideas is good by itself, but the city was able to put them all together.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think you could have gotten some of the boom with any one of these pieces, and it's the fact that they had so many pieces in place at one time in a coordinated manner, and then with kind of a lot of outreach, right? So bringing RXR in, as part of a developer community, that tipped other people off and said, hey, this is a place where there's an opportunity right now. And then the generic environmental impact study, it's good for a certain number of housing units in a certain number of years. So if you're a developer and you wait too long, well, it's going to expire, or the 7,000 units will get used up. And so this sort of basically cost that has already been paid up front by RXR will go away, and then you'll have to pay it. So, right, if you come back to New Rochelle in 15 years, you're probably going to have to do an environmental impact study unless they do the same process over again. So that sort of created like, hey, you need to do this now because the city has created a window where it's easier to get in. It's that sort of creates some catalytics. One thing that I think is really worth focusing on, especially for cities that maybe have a weaker tax base, is that the city was able to compensate RXR without doing anything from its budget, right? So it had some city-owned land, which was not worth very much, and they sold it to RXR, if I understand it, sort of the pre-reform price. So if RXR's entire process, if the form-based code had been a disaster, if the whole idea had failed, RXR wouldn't have made any money. They would have lost some money on the deal. They did some work and they get this property, and it turns out the property's not worth much. By compensating them in property, they had an incentive to make the whole thing work, right? So RXR is going to do better financially if the rules are written well, because they have to play by the rules that everybody else is playing by. And if there's really catalytic change downtown, because then those properties become worth much more, rather than if they're just kind of one-off development opportunities. So I really like the idea of sort of bringing in an expert. So you're not just asking your city staff to do all this work, but not paying them with money. Instead, sort of making them drink their own soup and say like, all right, make the soup, see how you like it. And I think that worked very well. And I can also imagine failures where it insulates the city. If you try to do this and somebody isn't actually up to the job and they fail, it insulates the city's bottom line. So you're not doing something like what poor Lordstown is doing, and rolling out millions in tax abatements every couple of years for the next savior.
Philip, I'm interested to know what you thought of this package of proposals when you first heard of it, and what are the things that developers look at to be confident in this project? Because as Noam and Salim pointed out, there was a very real upfront investment from the developer to make this work.
Well, I was actually working at RXR, and I was on the team that came up with the rezoning in collaboration with the city. So, I think that I had some input into what we focus on, what would really work, what would incentivize people to move, and so it covered all the bases. It covered how much can I build? How many floors can I build in this area? And if I do certain other things, I know exactly what I can build in terms of a bonus. I have a choice of things that I can put into my project to get that bonus. And it's it's an even playing field. So when you're when other developers are bidding on a piece of land, they're all looking at the same set of facts. And that's very transparent. And it's unusual. I mean, I've never been involved with anything that like this before. I haven't seen it in any other town.
So for everybody watching, the report includes this menu of amenities that were developed. Actually, Philip, I want you to talk a little bit more about it, because it was developed by listening sessions you had in the community. People identified things they wanted. What were some of those things, and how did developers work with that menu to incorporate them? And then what was the benefit the developer saw for incorporating something like that?
Right. So we went out with the city to the different communities in New Rochelle and said, if downtown isn't living up to expectations, what would you like to see there? And what components of of a new downtown New Rochelle would be interesting to you? So we have historic renovation as one thing. We have special green components that make a building very environmentally positive. If you do additional affordable housing, there's that too. There's open space, additional open space that you put into your project that you can get a bonus, and it's very defined what the bonus will get you. So it's not an individual sort of behind the scenes deal that you cut,
Right.
Which is the way this usually happens. It's if you do X, you can get Y. If you're in this zone and you have 6 stories that you can build without a bonus, you can build 8 stories if you do a bonus. So it's very transparent.
Give me an example of what that bonus might be. I think you would talk before about a black box theater. So explain that.
Yes, so RXR had one of the sites that RXR is developing had been a theater. We're building a tower next to it, and so we thought we could give something back to the community and in exchange get a bonus. So that we went from 24 stories as of right to 28 stories. So we ended up building 28 stories, and I think, Noam, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe most of the development projects have utilized one or more of those community benefit bonuses.
Yeah,
so that
and as Phil pointed out, there's a palette of options, including, if all else fails, a cash payment that the city can use for other public goods. But to cite another example, we had a sort of an underutilized, poorly designed public plaza that is being entirely reconstructed in conjunction with another major project downtown. So that's an open space enhancement that's being achieved through this community benefit framework. And as we look this year to refresh and update the downtown overlay zone, we're really going to lean heavily into environmental and social governance principles. So we're going to beef up the components of the community benefit framework that provide for climate justice and environmental justice, including off-site environmental enhancements that may deal with things like the urban heat island effect. We're going to beef up components related to workforce development and MWBE capacity building, and we're enhancing our affordability standards. So this is, as much as we're proud of the product we put in place in 2015, we've also tried to learn from the experience since then. And we think that through these refinements, we can maintain everything that's been positive in terms of a welcoming investment climate, and at the same time address evolving public concerns and priorities by directing the proceeds of development towards things that are community objectives.
If you had brought this idea to me years ago, I might have wondered, gosh, the public is so accustomed to being asked to approve things individually or maybe at the late stage. And yet here you got public buy-in early on and then proceeded with development. How often, if at all, did you have people kind of wanting to show up at the end and veto construction or veto styles and kind of act the way that they had been accustomed to in the past?
Well, look, that still does occur. And I get it, and it's legitimate. And when changes are occurring in one's community, it is natural to have opinions about that change, and in some cases to want to express those opinions. And there are multiple venues in which people can do that. And look, in part, the objections are from folks who are just not on board with the fundamental vision of growth. They preferred New Rochelle as it was. They are entitled to their views. They should be treated with respect. But I have a different view, and I think the majority of people in New Rochelle have a different view. For the most part, I think people in this city are accepting of the trade-off, the basic bargain that we struck of let's all talk together about what we want New Rochelle to be, and then let's execute. And to the extent people have concerns about individual projects, when we remind them of the process we've gone through to define what is permissible and what is not permissible, when we remind them of the benefits that will flow from development in terms of the physical fabric of the city, in terms of job creation, in terms of our tax base, in terms of a wider range of goods and services that will be available close to home. For the most part, people are satisfied that the overall course we're taking is one from which they will ultimately benefit.
And Noam, let me ask, as a skeptic of all sorts of urban development policy, did you really have no cash outlay, or did you really not forego any tax revenue, no abatements or TIF? Can something like this be done without that?
To be clear, we do have a schedule of tax incentives that is available on a uniform basis, and we judge that necessary for our overall competitiveness, even with the enhanced approvals that we were able to offer. However, those incentives are far less generous than what was previously being offered on a one-off basis. And we satisfied ourselves that the new revenue that would be flowing into the city, and for that matter, our school district as well, which actually consumes a larger share of the tax bill, we satisfied ourselves that the revenue that would be flowing in would far exceed any new costs, and therefore taxpayers would be a significant winner as a result of the work that we are undertaking. We also put in place an innovative revenue stream that we call a fair share mitigation fund. And this is in addition to the annual payments that are required of developers. Each developer must make a one-time payment related to the square footage and use structure of their project that is intended to pay for capital and infrastructure needs. So rather than pegging those to the specific traffic impacts of Project X, we generalized it across the entire downtown area. And in keeping with what Phil said earlier, this provides for a very predictable cost structure for any investor who's looking at opportunities in New Rochelle, and at the same time, generates the income that the city and the school district needs for any capital expenditures that may be associated with growth.
I think that's been about 20 million or so that's come in various forms of those fees. So when the public says, this is going to be a burden on the community, the city can now say, actually, we've covered that. We looked at the 10 years of growth, what the needs would be, and divided it up so that each project has to make their incremental payment to get there.
Philip, at the time this was put together, I'm sure RXR and the city had projections as to how much investment you'd get or how many new units. How does what we've seen in the last few years compare to what you thought might happen?
Far exceeds it. I was the one who proposed that we put 5,000 units in the 10-year plan that we developed, that the market could absorb 5,000 units over that 10-year period. And instead, New Rochelle has 7,000 units developed in a 4-year period. So it was way beyond even what I was saying, and people thought I was crazy.
So Salim, having researched this and written about it, what are the lessons, whether you're share the same demographics or don't, whether you're outside a bigger labor population or not? What can other cities learn?
Yeah, so there's a few good lessons here. So we talked about having multiple things in place at once. That's not required everywhere, right? Some places don't want to have a huge amount of investment and might say, well, this is a little scary. But I think the real foundational building block, right, has to be the zoning. Because ultimately, none of the other pieces can be predictable if the zoning isn't in place, because then you've got to go through a rezoning, which is going to be a public process, which means that there's going to be political considerations and negotiations and extractions. And then you can't have all this other stuff, the schedule of fees, the environmental impact surveys. All of that was about predictability. But if the zoning's not in place, then none of that is really going to hit you in the bottom line, because you're going to have to go through the rezoning anyway. So if a city's just going to do one of these pieces, I think the rezoning is the foundation. But you can clearly go further. And for cities that already say like, we have good zoning in place, we're getting the kinds of construction that we want, that are dense, that make good sense for our city, that our residents love, but we want to have more of it. Well, then you can go on to this sort of, I think, the stuff that you build on top of that foundation. And that's really what this last conversation was about, is certainty rather than payment, right? So instead of chasing a developer with money, you're putting the certainty in your schedule. So, and other cities have done this well too, in a totally different approach, in a very different cost context. Akron, Ohio, and a lot of other cities have actually done this, put in place a state program that allows them to completely abate taxes on residential improvements for up to 15 years. So the idea is, Akron's a town that's been through, a lot of rough times going back to the early 70s, hasn't completely come back. They want residential improvement. They really want that. It's a positive spillover in their neighborhoods, and they're not getting it. So putting in place the tax abatement said, hey, if you want to build brand new homes, build them here instead of the suburbs. And some builders have started to do that. But what's there is, it's the certainty and the equal treatment of all comers, the small builders, the big builders. Everybody kind of gets to come to the table, say, oh, this is the price schedule. Okay, if I want to build 4 extra stories, I can do that if I provide X benefit. Oh, if I want to build in New Rochelle, this is my fair share fee, which is just an impact fee. It's not uncertain. It's there. You put it on your pro forma. And ultimately, developers can work with that, because they can, the costs go down to the customers. As long as the customers can pay the cost, then it can work out. The developers fundamentally in our system, what they sell is risk management, right? Everyone else in the process gets paid. The lumber mill, they get paid for the lumber. The electrician gets paid for his services. The city gets its taxes. Everybody gets certainty. All the risk in the process gets pushed down to the developer. And that's okay, right? That's their job. It's a model. Shrinking that risk means you can get a lot more development at a lower or more modest price point. And I think that's really, the big lesson here is, you get the zoning right, and then you start to squeeze the uncertainty out of the system. Doesn't mean you let anybody do whatever they want. You're still setting the terms, but the terms are fair and equal to everyone. And that's really important.
I had an economic development. Oh, go ahead, Philip.
No, I was just going to say part of it also, I think a big part of it is politics and how it's set up. So my example earlier about homeowners being worried about their worth of the keeping the value of their homes. Well, in New Rochelle, none of this rezoning was in a single family residential area. So it didn't impact those people. It was only 5%, and it was the downtown. So I think in other communities that have a downtown, and make the focus on that, and bringing more people in the downtown also helps the downtown merchants. And there's a lot of benefits to that without threatening the single family homes. And when you look at the reforms that are going on elsewhere around the country, where single family zoning is being outlawed, that gets a lot of people riled up. And you can, give a lot of good reasons, but that sounds pretty threatening to outlaw single family zoning. So I think the genius that New Rochelle had was to concentrate it in an area where it really made sense, and not to alienate all the homeowners out there.
One of the things I learned, I'm in Kansas City, Missouri, that I learned from an economic development professional when I was, as I often do, complaining about subsidies. He said, you have to understand developers need the subsidies in order to make building in our city worth it. And that was a believable and completely understandable statement, but it was even more frustrating for me because I realized the city is making it more expensive to build within its limits and then subsidizing the additional costs. So it's like the public is getting socked twice. One, we're making it more difficult, and two, then we're paying for people to overcome the barriers we've set up. So Noam, talk to me about the last, again, few years. What has changed? Obviously, you've got a lot more construction, but do you sense the degree to which the community has changed at all? Again, Philip made the point that we're just talking about 5% of the land. We're just talking about downtown, but certainly people are, maybe for better and worse, looking at the city a different way than they did 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah, so I'll run through the landscape. Here's what's going really well. As we've already detailed, the quantity of investment that's flowing into New Rochelle is unprecedented. It is changing our skyline almost by the day. Multiple cranes that are in place, several projects already occupied, others that are finishing up. So New Rochelle physically looks very different from how it did a few years ago. And for those of us who believe in growth, that is exciting. It gives a sense of vitality and positive change. At the same time, there are growing pains, without a doubt. A lot of our streets are torn up. There are constant traffic detours. New utility lines have to be put in to service growth. There's noise associated with construction. So we're very much in the thick of that. And again, I think most people are accepting of that trade-off if they are satisfied that the challenges today will lead to a better city tomorrow. That's a deal that they will take. But we still need to be sensitive to and to mitigate those short-term impacts to the degree that it's possible. What we still haven't seen is the change at the street level. That kind of vibrancy that comes when a downtown has a density of positive activity that makes you feel like when you visit, there's always going to be something worth seeing around the corner, as opposed to just making a surgical strike to one use and then leaving. I am very confident that once these new projects are filled and we have a sufficient critical mass of buying power to support entrepreneurs and new businesses in the downtown, that positive change will happen organically, even without the pushes that we intend to provide. But it's not here yet. And until we reach that state where people feel like, boy, I'm really proud of my downtown, I'm really excited to either live in or visit my downtown, those of us in city leadership, and I think many members of the public, will regard this as an unfinished process. So we're doing well. Our trend lines are great, if anything ahead of expectations, but we're not fully through the journey yet.
So the innovation was introduced, you said, in 2015, I think. When did construction, as you see it today, begin in earnest, and how much until you see kind of the original plan fulfilled? How much longer?
So I have to search my memory right now. I think construction began almost immediately after the adoption in 2015 with RXR's first project. It's the one that Phil mentioned earlier that has the black box theater at its base, and several others that began very shortly thereafter. So it happened quite quickly. And we've seen demand very high. For the projects that are completed, they're more than 90% leased up, which is ahead of expectations. So obviously the housing demand is strong.
We have, let me encourage anybody who's watching, if you have questions for any of our panelists, put them in the Q&A tab and we'll endeavor to get to them in the next few minutes. Our first question, Noam, is for you. Can you provide some more detail on the enhanced opportunity for RXR to develop on public property? What advantage do they get over other developers downtown?
So essentially, RXR has an exclusive on our publicly owned sites, which are mainly parking lots. Provided they deliver parking either through preservation or replacement to the city's satisfaction, they have the right to acquire the properties through a formula that we determined upfront. The city cannot market those properties to some other developer during the term of our agreement with RXR. Again, that is a very small minority of the land area within the redevelopment zone. There have got to be about a dozen developers who are in our sandbox right now. So this by no means has had the effect of shutting out others in the development community from working in New Rochelle. But for those publicly owned properties, RXR has an exclusive.
And do they have a window of time to exercise that?
Yes, and it escapes me what that window of time is. Perhaps it's 10 years. Maybe Phil, you remember what the duration of the agreement is?
I think it's 10 years. There are certain milestones that we have to meet during that 10-year time.
And once a specific project is approved, it has a 2-year window in which it can execute construction or the entitlement is extinguished. And by the way, as Phil pointed out, we have approved just about 7,000 units of housing already. These are approved projects that have gotten their site plan resolved by the planning board, and they're ready to go. And we're talking now in the context of the DOZ refresh about increasing the number of units to 10,000. So we want to make sure that we keep our momentum going.
One of the things that the paper talks about, one of the innovations is ministerial approval. So I'm not used to that term. It looks like approval was granted in advance, and as long as you stay within certain perimeters, you don't have to worry about the planning board coming back and saying no. Do I understand that correctly?
I think that's just another way of saying what we've been talking about throughout the webinar, that the normal political choke points that would require public hearings and votes on the part of the city council, all that was handled up front. And so what's required right now is a permit from the Bureau of Buildings, site plan from the planning board, which is governed by strict predetermined standards. So generally speaking, if a developer comes to us with all the information necessary to process a permit, we can go from that submission to approval within 60 to 90 days, which is lightning fast, as everyone on this call will recognize, lightning fast for the development world.
And you've been able to keep those promises, that the approvals that have happened so far have been on that fixed schedule. So it's pretty amazing.
Philip, I imagine you take this model to other cities you want to work with. Have they been interested? Are they skeptical? I imagine it's so new that simply that alone might be an obstacle to getting people to consider it.
It's new, but it's hard to be skeptical when you see the results. You know, there's a lot of research, a lot of policy innovations and stuff, but you just come to New Rochelle and you can see that it worked. So for cities that have the attributes that we talked about, where there's clearly demand and what's hampering supply is are the regulations and the complexity of the regulations. People are very interested in it, and I think it's going to be imitated. Some parts will be different. Maybe instead of parking lots, maybe there's a big anchor project, a single big anchor project that a developer does and funds this reform out of that. So I think there's other ways to accomplish it. I think there's also rezonings of industrial areas into residential, which it's a different solution, but it's the same problem. So yeah, I think it's going to be copied by other in certain respects by others.
Well, in the few minutes we have left, I'm just curious, Noam, what lessons did you learn from this project that either you can apply to other parts of the city or other public-private partnerships that you're involved with?
Well, as Phil said, we learned that it works. It's one thing to sort of plan it out theoretically and satisfy yourselves that it ought to work. It's another thing to see it actually play out in the real world. So that's been very gratifying. As I said a short while ago, I do think there are some things we could have done better and are now doing better with respect to ESG, environmental and social governance. And so I think the next wave of projects will build upon and be even better than the last wave. I do wish that we had maybe paid a little bit more attention to architecture. This is obviously subjective and personal, but I'd say some of the projects are very appealing and others less so. So I think an enhanced level of architectural review is appropriate, especially when you're talking about projects that will sort of visibly define your community, both from up close and from far away. But the bottom line is, this is a framework that works. And, there are some communities that don't need it because their intrinsic assets are so compelling. There are other communities that don't necessarily want it. They're satisfied with the status quo. But for the communities in between, this is a powerful model that can be replicated.
Philip, what lessons have you learned from this project? Again, either specific to New Rochelle or how you deal with other cities,
Yeah, I mean, it's there's always a lot of talk about public-private collaboration, but I've seen the real thing up close, and it can really accomplish some great things. I think there's a power in simplification. The zoning laws, I think pretty much every community has an intricate zoning configuration, and one town next to the other has a completely different zoning framework. So it's a little bit crazy. But I think that standardization within New Rochelle was very helpful. And I think standardization, or the option of standardization at least, across cities, say within a state, where a state offers this type of reform as an option, and just makes the process a little bit smoother. So I would say, so simplification, and also we've talked about this before about abstraction, that looking at each project by project, you can always poke holes and say, it's too modern, it's too traditional, there's a lot of things you can critique. But when it's more of an abstraction to say, this is our downtown, it's not doing so well, what can we do? If there's density, if there's density anywhere, it should be in the downtown. So let's figure out these rings of density that go down and out into the communities and don't affect the single family. So I think it's the abstract nature of that was very helpful to getting people to buy into it.
Salim, when I tell people I work in public policy, housing, and taxation, they don't think it's exciting. I actually enjoy it. So what excites you about this? What did you learn? What do you take away from this example in New Rochelle?
Yeah, so I mean, it's easy for me to get excited about all this stuff because I love cities, and I really enjoy getting to go to places. I think I don't know how people did this job before Google Earth, because I'm talking to people all over the country all the time, and I can't go everywhere. Certainly not the first time I interact with somebody, but I've made a point of stopping off in New Rochelle a couple times, driving between Maryland and Boston, and you get to see physical changes on the ground. And I think it's really important to see that both the political will matters, but that it's not quite enough, right? And I think what's really interesting in the case of New Rochelle was that this was a city with really high demand, high prices, and that wanted growth for a decade or two or three before these changes. And so this is really an argument for policy, that policy matters, and being vaguely pro-development, as generations of New Rochelle leaders were, is fine, but it's not enough. I got a question in the Q&A from Eric Cousins, who's the planning director of Auburn, Maine, which is another community that I've gotten to work with that's similarly on the forefront of modern changes in zoning. And I think there's slightly different lessons to be learned in Auburn, partly because they didn't have as many barriers, in terms of like the state required environmental impact for downtown growth. But they also have a form-based code, which they recently expanded, that covers the downtown and the adjacent neighborhoods, so sort of the 19th century neighborhoods that are around the center of Auburn, Maine. This year, they made news by eliminating any parking requirements at all in that zone. And so Auburn's done a really good job, similarly, of using a form-based code and not putting a bunch of use restrictions in it. I think where form-based codes fail is when you get cities that say, oh yeah, we want to regulate the look and feel but we also don't want, any businesses on this street or any residences on that street. And then you get a use code and a form-based code, and essentially, you've only got one specific building that you're going to allow on every site, and predictably those don't work very well. So Auburn, as well as New Rochelle, a different scale of demand, different scale of prices. They're also seeing growth. The other decision that I think Auburn made that's really important and underrated in a lot of cities is locating the key city facilities correctly. So they're rebuilding the high school, where a lot of cities in Auburn's position would have bought a cheap, big piece of land out on the outskirts of town and built a new high school there. Auburn's keeping it on its original site adjacent to downtown. And when I was there up in Auburn this May, what I saw was this huge stream of traffic of people coming in from the outer neighborhoods, coming into central Auburn to drop off their kids or go to work at the school or whatever. And you're creating business for everything downtown. You're making Auburn a place that people go to every day as opposed to a place that they drive away from. And that's something that, whatever the scale of your city, you are making those decisions whenever you're citing locations, state facilities, city facilities, and doing those siting decisions in a context where you've got rural land that's cheap. It's tempting to just go dump it out in the outskirts of town, but I think that really eviscerates the kinds of downtowns and economic strength that come from co-locating a bunch of people and a bunch of uses and letting good things happen.
Let me thank everyone who's viewed today, spent an hour with us. Let me thank our panelists, Philip Wharton, Noam Bramson, and Salim Furth, for your time putting this report together. If you want to learn more, I encourage viewers to go to the Better Cities website and download that report, take a look at it yourself. And if you want to follow up with any of our panelists, you can reach us again at better-cities.org, and we can put you in touch if we can't answer the question ourselves. Thank you again, everyone. Gentlemen, thank you for your work today. And thank you, everybody who's been viewing. Take care.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you all. That was a great conversation.